What's up, everyone? More reading. Hope everyone's well. Pieces and love. Captain Church also set Robert up with a woman. The Victoria was often filled with young white women who were part of bridal parties. Sometimes there were as many as 5 groups of bachelorettes aboard at once. Though in general, Captain Church may have given Robert whatever he wanted. Giving Robert whatever he wanted, the young women who were guests on the captain's ship were off limits. Just after Robert turned 18, Captain Church arranged for Robert to have a slave marriage. Slave marriage with a woman named Margaret Pico, who was owned by friends of his in New Orleans. Marriages arranged between people owned by slave. I don't know why I feel so out of it, guys. Marriages arranged between 2 people owned by slaveholders were explicitly sexual in nature, as the expectation was that the coupling would result in children and produce more slaves for the owners. Captain Church often lodged with the family that owned Margaret when he spent a few days in New Orleans at the end of the Victoria's run. After Robert and Margaret's marriage was arranged, whenever the captain and his son went to New Orleans, the captain would deposit Robert into Margaret's slave quarters, where he would spend the duration of their stay in New Orleans. In 1859, Robert and Margaret produced a daughter, whom they named Laura. In the fall of 1860, Abraham Lincoln's victory in the presidential election sent shockwaves through the South, setting off a chain of events that would lead to the Civil War. Captain Church's steamship's line was entangled with slavery. His business relied on shipping cotton picked on slave plantations to ports along the Mississippi. Talk of war could be heard among the passengers as Bob walked the dining halls on board the ships during the meal service. On April 19, 1861, in the first days of the Civil War, President Lincoln ordered the Union Navy to blockade all southern waterways, cutting off the South trade with Europe, interfering with the Confederacy transportation of troops and provisions on the waterways. Lincoln deployed 500 warships to ports in the Atlantic Ocean and on Mississippi and Ohio rivers to destroy any Confederate ships carrying supplies. Not long after the blockade was announced, Robert was on board the Victoria when a group of Confederate sailors wearing a gray military uniform boarded the ship. The men announced that they were commandeering the ship on behalf of the Confederate Navy. My sympathies were with the Union, though I did own slaves, the captain claimed, saying he was given no choice but to turn over his ship with his black son aboard it. The Confederacy renamed the boat Confederate Steamship Victoria. Robert was conscripted to the CSS Victoria in the employ of the rebel Navy. The boat was used to transport troops and military supplies up and down the Mississippi, using its speed to outrun the blockade fleet. If a ship was caught, the Union Navy had instructions to destroy and sink it. While Bob was working as a Confederate blockade runner, his younger brother, James Wilson, was conscribed into the Confederate Army as a soldier in Arkansas. Emmeline had hoped during her dying days to save her son from slavery, and now they found themselves aiding the Confederacy in the war to protect the rights of white Southerners to hold black men like themselves in bondage. Near daybreak on June 6, 1862, as the sun was rising over the Mississippi River, Robert Reed Church was on the deck of the CSS Victoria. The ship was floating just outside of the Memphis Wharf, looking out onto the fleet of Confederate warships further out on the river. Waiting for a coming battle, the Union Navy was approaching to invade and conquer Memphis. Robert stood on the deck with the crew members and Confederate sailors. Watching the approaching fleet drew closer, feeling both uncertainty and excitement. The Union warships would perhaps bring freedom if they were victorious, but they also could bring death if they sank a ship. There were 8 Confederate ships in the river guarding the city. Each of them had cotton bales stacked like bricks against all 4 sides of their superstructures to protect against any light artillery. The cotton-clad, well, it sounds like they could just burn it down, man. The cotton-clad flotilla was poorly named. In total, the rebel ships had 8 cannons. The Union fleet was twice the size of the Confederate. Its 17 ships were assembled into 2 battle lines moving down the river. The exterior clad with irons, armed with guns and cannons. In another line were 9 ram boats with 6-foot-long knife-like structures on their front end. These beaks could puncture the hulls of the enemy ships when smashed into them. flooding and sinking them. In the early mornings, more than 5,000 Memphians made their way from their homes to the edge of the river to watch the battle. They stood in groups on the bluffs, 20 feet up from the fighting. That's crazy. They're probably just watching a slow-mo fight happening. The Union fleet stopped 200 feet from the city. Then the air exploded with the steady drone of gunfire. About 5:30 a.m., the Bragg came up towards us and opened fire. A Confederate soldier later reported it was answered by us instantly. The fleets exchanged fire for more than an hour, with neither side taking much damage. By the time they were done, the river was covered in smoke and the air smelled of gunpowder. In the haze, 2 Union ram boats came charging toward the Confederate ships. They knifed at the hulls, sinking one, the CSS Colonel Lovell, and damaged several others. Puncturing their hulls, and the Confederate ships scrambled. The Union gunboats sailed into deadly range of the Confederate ships and opened fire. The Union ships shot up and breached one Confederate ship after another. On the bluff, the citizens of Memphis, who had been cheering the gunfight, fell silent. After the Union Navy sank 3 Confederate ships, the Confederate flotilla surrendered. When the battle was over, a Union ship began to close on Robert's ship, the CSS Victoria. Something inside Robert told him to flee. He followed his instinct. He walked to the edge of the boat, gathered his nerve, and jumped. With a splash, he disappeared into the Mississippi as the sun came over Memphis. In the hours after the Battle of Memphis, the river was churning and muddy. As the gun smoke cleared, scraps of wood, cotton, and metal from the destroyed Confederate ships littered the surface of the water. Downriver, Robert Reed Church paddled and kicked toward the shores of Memphis. He swam to the bank and pulled himself onto land. As he collected himself on solid ground, his hair stuck to his face and scalp, and his sopping, wet, muddy clothing clung to his frame. What was he at the moment? A slave, a freedman, a deserter? Whom did he belong to? The Confederacy, the Union, his father, himself? There was only one way to be sure. He collected himself and headed toward the city, dripping water as if he had just been baptized. He was unafraid of whatever awaited him. He had just survived his second flirtation with a watery grave. Slavery and brushes with death had wrung whatever fear he had been born with from his breast. In Memphis, Robert found men, both black and white, wearing the Union uniforms and carrying guns, stationed on corners, patrolling the town. High in the sky, he could see the Union flag flying over City Hall. After the Battle of Memphis, the mayor surrendered the city to the Union, suspending slavery in the town. At that moment, Robert dared to think he was free. Damn, that's a short chapter. Chapter number 5, The Near Lynching of a Millionaire, July 1863. So 2 more minutes, guys, or girls, people. Late one hot evening in New York City, a lynch mob made up of white men and adolescent boys marched down East 29th Street in Manhattan toward the home of New York's richest black man, Jeremiah Hamilton. They wore dingy shirts with the sleeves rolled up and leather boots and carried revolvers, rifles, clubs, and sharpened sticks. As they marched down the gravel street toward the brownstone where Hamilton lived, they bellowed out his house number, 68, 68, 68, and waved their weapons above their head. Hamilton and his wife, Eliza, heard the chants reverberating through the walls of their home. Hamilton was perhaps New York's most infamous African-American man. He was a ruthless Wall Street broker, lived in a brownstone in all-white section of the city, and was married to a white woman 15 years his junior. Damn, it's wild, man. In the 1800s. His skin was the color of mahogany. He wore expensive gray and black suits and a wig of flowing black hair. He was referred to as Prince of Darkness and Nigger Hamilton as the newspapers cataloged his financial and social dealings in New York. He could hear the boots of the men down on the streets and their yelling and taunts as they drew closer to his house. Out of options, he bolted out the back door, jumped the back fence of his house, and ran away, down 28th Street. As the men drew closer, Eliza was left behind to face the mob alone. The streets had been a war zone for 2 days, ever since the federal government had begun draft lotteries for the Civil War. After the first names were drawn in New York, the city exploded in violence as working-class white men took to the streets and raged against the prospect of being forced to fight and end the enslavement of African Americans. In mobs of thousands, they overpowered the police, destroyed government buildings, lynched and crucified black citizens, and destroyed black churches and orphanages. High-profile African Americans were hunted as prize kills for lynch mobs. The day before they set up Hamilton's home, rioters had sacked and burned the pharmacy that belonged to James McCune Smith, America's first black medical doctor. James McCune Smith. Okay. When they arrived at Hamilton's house, the men began to scream, "Bring the nigger out!" One of Hamilton's white neighbors came outside and told the mob he wasn't home, but the mob ignored his pleas to leave and continued shouting, "Nigger!" and "Bring him out!" One of the men told the neighbor, "There's a nigger living in there with 2 white women, and we are going to bring him out and hang him from the lamppost." The men climbed Hamilton's stoop and began slamming their shoulders into the front door. When it wouldn't give, one of the men ran around the back of the house and rammed into the basement door. He ran up the stairs into the parlor floor of the house, followed by a dozen other rioters. At the top of the stairs, they were met by Eliza Jane Hamilton. Eliza was tall with pale skin, a down-turned mouth, and brown hair that she wore in a French braid. "What do you want?" she asked the men. "Mr. Hamilton." One man grunted. "We're going to kill him," another threatened. "Why?" Eliza demanded. "Trying to appear unafraid. Revenge," another man yelled. The men pushed past Eliza and spread out across the house to look for Hamilton. They scoured the house 5 bedrooms, its long hallways, its closets, basement, the dining room, the parlor for the rich black man they had come to lynch. Along the way, they looted his home, stuffing items of value they found in the house into their shirts and pockets. Observing the commotion through the blinds, his neighbors locked their doors and bolted their windows. 2 neighbors came outside and stood on their stoops to see what was going on. There's trouble at the Hamiltons, and they supported that they were going to burn him out and hang him, the first neighbor said. "Will you go down?" the other neighbor asked. "No." "You won't stand here and see a man murdered without going to help him?" the neighbor asked after a break in the conversation. The other neighbor didn't answer. Inside the house, a man with a revolver came downstairs and confronted Eliza. "Give us all your liquor and cigars," he demanded. "I have no liquor," she told them. "I have cider." She went to fetch the cigars and cider. Looting went on for half an hour, and it seemed as though the men had no intention of leaving. Some of the men sat down on Hamilton's parlor chairs, chaises, and sofas, and put their feet up, smoking cigars and guzzling cider. 45 minutes later, the men became convinced that Hamilton wasn't there and concluded that they had stolen all that there was to steal. One by one, they finally gave up and left. Hamilton, the richest black man in New York, narrowly escaped death that day. However, it was the fleetness of his feet and not his wealth and talent that saved his life. There had been a time when he believed that his money would protect him from racism. His brush with death in the hands of a white mob was perhaps proof that African Americans, even they had the opportunity and skill to amass a fortune, would still face threats to their lives and prosperity. Similar to the ones the masses of African Americans faced, perhaps greater because of their stature. Hamilton died in his 70s, a decade after the Civil War ended. And the time of his death in 1875, he had a net worth of nearly $1 million, making him at the time the richest black man in the United States. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Have a great night. Rest of your night, everyone. Pieces.